So, today we're going to do an amazing trip through time to look at our evolution and how we ended up on this particular spot and what happened along the way. If we start looking at evolution, we always have to remember Darwin's tree. So he had the idea that we can trace ancestry through genealogical lines and represent that through phylogenetic trees. So in theory, we could use fossil records and work out who was our last common ancestor, for example, right, as branches, like diverge, like there's one animal that was common to all four different species, and that in theory is a really nice method. The problem though is as we try and work out, the common ancestor, we often have very little information. The fossil record is very patchy, and what we will see as we go through it, there's often so much confusion and a lot of speculation about who might have been our ancestor, how many ancestors have been around at that time. So there's a lot of uncertainty about quite a few of the things that we're going to cover today. So compare this, fragmented tree with that beautiful drawing by Darwin. What has come to the rescue is various different fields. People have started looking at, for example, other primates, so non-human primates, and how they evolved. We have started to use information from genetics and also the different adaptations that modern humans have today can also tell us something about our ancestral history. So there are lots of techniques coming from other disciplines, genomics, um, cell cultures, very common in biology, um, reconstruction, for example, from proteins, gene editing, and all of these techniques can give us really new insights into what our ancestors might have looked like, what they might have eaten, the state of their health, and also one of the crucial questions, how did our brains develop to what we have today? So with all of that in mind, now we have to set out and create a little bit of order. Who are we? We means primates. So great apes, monkeys, etc., etc. I'm going to use some relatively recent phylogenetic studies where people have looked at the mitochondria, so the energy parts in our cell, to reconstruct how we might be related to each other. And if you look at it, we have all sorts of animals like these little cute tarsiers, lemurs, these lories that are related to us. So those are the most distant family members that we have. And this is what such a phylogenetic tree might look like. So this one here is based on, as I said, the mitochondria, and then looking at the similarities between all these different species. So up here we have the great apes, down here we have lories and lemurs, etc., etc. We can reconstruct how closely they are related to each other genetically, and when back in time, so here we have time plotted into this phylogenetic tree, when was it most likely that we had a common ancestor? And what we can see here, so looking at these lemurs and lories and other cute little animals, they most likely split from our main line about 81 to 61 million years ago. So if you remember, dinosaurs died out about 66 million years ago. So that is roughly around the time when dinosaurs were still around. So our ancestors were playing with little dinosaur cute babies. I don't think it happened that way, but our line goes all the way back to the time when dinosaurs were still roaming planet Earth. So this is the our most distant line of relatives, loris and lemurs. The next line that would yeah, and quickly, just to give you an idea of what the world looked like as these animals, like had their last common ancestor with us. Um, for example, North America and Europe and Asia were still connected. Africa and South America had split already, and India was still a huge continent drifting up towards Eurasia. So the Earth looked quite different back then. So the next one, as these shifts happening around the world, the next animal line to split off were those little tarsiers, about 77 to 64 million years ago. So with all the uncertainty that we have, it might still be the case that our last common ancestor with these little tarsiers was around the time when also dinosaurs were still around. So tarsiers are cute little creatures. They used to be quite widespread, quite common. Today they're mainly restricted to a couple of islands in Southeast Asia. They're really funny little creatures. So they can turn their head 180 degrees. They have these huge eyes um, that are really good at nocturnal, so night vision. Um, they use echolocation to find their prey. They are eating only protein, so little insects, little reptiles, and so what happens is they are mainly night active, so they have a really good visual system, and then in order to attack their prey, they have these cute little legs, and they can jump very explosively, very rapidly. So they're quite well adapted for a nightlife where they need to capture fast-moving insects or reptiles. The interesting thing is, even though they split away from our line such a long time ago, we do share genes with them. And the interesting thing, or the interesting observation is that Schmitz and others, they did a genomic study in 2016, and then they looked at all these genes in tarsiers and looked at equivalent genes in humans, and genes that are quite adaptive for the tarsier, allowing the tarsier to lead his nocturnal life, like preying on all these insects and lizards and little other reptiles. These genes are some variants of those genes are still with us today, and for us, these genes create problems. So there are about 47 human diseases associated with genetic variants that we have in common with the tarsier. These include, for example, problems with atrophy, so like muscle and skeletal problems. So in the tarsier, these genes allow the tarsier to very explosively and quickly jump. So there are genes that regulate muscle growth, flexibility. But in humans, we obviously don't need these adaptations. They create problems. The same with vision. So the tarsier, the visual system is really well adapted for like hunting at night. In humans, these genes now create problems like, for example, cataracts. So this is again to show evolution is kind of blind, and once you have a certain set of genes, it may be adapted for some purposes in some species, in some environments, but as you are a descendant or you have some common ancestors with an animal that has used those genes to his or her advantage, in another line it might actually create problems. So there is no move towards higher, better complexity. Evolution is blind. So, and with all this work on genes, we have to also quickly come back and have a look at some of these weird genetic effects. We are most likely familiar with the idea that each gene has one specific effect. If you think, for example, about Mendel's laws, this is what we typically understand, that each gene codes for one protein which then has one specific effect. But what we already saw is genes often have multiple effects. So you might have one gene that codes for one protein, and then this protein reacts with a lot of other processes in our body, and therefore, like creates this kind of cascading effect across lots of different areas. So this is what is called Pliotropy, a gene basically having multiple effects. And this is very common. If you think about the number of genes that we have, and then all the different things that have to be organized and regulated in our body, we have to have genes that can regulate more than one function in our body. So pleiotropy is most likely a very important, or is a very important process that we have to consider when talking about genes, that genes have these multiple effects quite often. But there's also the opposite one, where we have polygenic traits, which means that one gene is not enough to bring about an effect, and you have often hundreds or thousands of genes that work in tandem, that work in combination in order to produce an effect. Even traits like, for example, height, so how tall or how small you are, it's highly genetically determined. So about 80% of your height is determined by your genes. Yet we can't figure out what specific genes are involved in that, because there are literally thousands and thousands of genes that have some kind of influence on your height. So it's an orchestra. You have to think about it as an orchestra of genes that brings about phenotypic traits most of the time. And so if we now put this together, polygenic and pleiotropy, we get into a very complex picture. So the fact that we can identify these 47 diseases in humans that we inherit or have in common, or like that can be traced back to a common ancestor with tarsiers, is pretty much an exception, because quite often these genes work in very complex ways in interaction with each other in order to bring about a specific phenotype. And this is something that we always have to keep in mind when we talk about genes are important. Genes are absolutely important to understand human biology, but there are all these kind of complex genetic effects going on that make it very difficult to pinpoint what specific gene might be responsible for what specific trait. And this brings me to the 4 laws of behavior genetics. You might have heard of them before. The most important one is that all human behavioral traits are heritable. There's virtually no human behavioral trait, nothing that we do that is not in some way regulated through genes. So genes, we have to look at genetic effects. There's no way getting around that. If you look at individuals in the same environment, then the effect of being raised in the same family, so your shared environment that you have in common with your siblings, is typically smaller than the effect of genes. This is something that often seems quite perplexing, because we have this feeling that, like living together with your family, sharing all these amazing experiences is so important for who you are. And this is often kind of a misconception also in areas like developmental psychology, where we try and understand what people do in order, so what parents do in order to provide for their kids, and how that might shape them. But a lot of studies have shown us that the most important thing, apart from providing a sufficiently safe environment, that parents can do is pass on their genes. It's very frustrating in a way, if you are thinking about it from a parent's perspective. So the important point here is that there's still something else going on. So the third law is that a substantial portion of the variation in complex human behavioral traits is not accounted for by the effects of either genes or family. And this is kind of reassuring, because that gives us the opportunity to make our own decision, our own mark. So these are the kind of unique living experiences that you have, that are not shared with your family, and that are not due to your genetic predispositions. So experience matters, but it is more the experience that each individual gains through his or her interaction with the environment that makes a difference. And the final one is what is sometimes referred to as the missing gene problem. Even though all behavioral traits are heritable, most traits are polygenic. So there are literally hundreds and thousands of genes that are important for specific behavioral phenotypes. So each of these genes now accounts for a tiny percentage of the behavioral variability. This is often called, as I already mentioned, the missing gene problem, because we know from from twin studies, for example, or we know through, for example, through pedigree studies, where we follow family lines and we can study the behavioral phenotypes within families, so we can work out what is the influence of genes on behavior. Yet we are not there yet, in order we don't understand yet what specific genes are responsible for these phenotypes. So this is the problem, and this fourth law of behavioral genetics is very important to keep in mind also as we move forward now and start talking about other humans in our ancestral line. But before we get to that, we have to look at some of these other splits in our family line. About 51 to 42 million years ago, the next group of animals started splitting off, and these are the animals that move towards the New World, so towards the Americas, and those animals that stayed in the Old World, so Africa, Europe, and Asia. And so we have to split into New World monkeys that are characterized by relatively flat faces, wide nostrils, and importantly, a tail that can be used for grabbing, for holding. And Old World monkeys, which have a more prolonged snout, closed nostrils, and no tail, or a tail that cannot be used for grabbing. And so these Old World monkeys now become the anthropoids. So these include the monkeys, the great apes, and us humans. So this split was really important. Um, and there are also interesting divergences between these New World monkeys in the Americas and us who stayed over in Africa, Asia, and Europe. Because we have a visual system that has three different distinct cones that allow us to distinguish blue, green, and red. In contrast, the New World monkeys in the Americas, they have a two-cone system. So they see the world slightly differently. So they have a trichromatic color system, whereas we have a trichromatic uh, color system. So which now means that, for example, we are much better of spotting, for example, red, so the color red in trees, for example. We are also better able to spot, for example, predators and other animals. So there have been all sorts of conversations and discussions of why this emerged, this feature emerged in our line in the old world. There are different discussions out there. There's some arguments that because the fruits and in particular fruits, ripening fruits in Africa often have specific red-shifted colors. So for our ancestors, it might have been very beneficial to be able to spot what fruit is ripe, whereas fruits ripe slightly differently in the Americas, so may not have created the same kind of pressure. Um, our ancestors, because of the greater discrimination that we can make in for example in foliage, we're better able, for example, to spot possible predators like the lowest picture there compared to those New World monkeys with a dichromatic color system. And there are also arguments that are potentially related to sexual selection, because for example some females in Old World monkeys, they signal that they're in their fertile period through color changes, which now those males that were better able to discern those signals and spot those signals may have had an advantage to pass on their genes. So basically, we don't know, but there are lots of interesting theories out there why our ancestors in Africa were able to develop this ability to discriminate colors in a different way than New World monkeys over in the Americas. As I said, one very plausible argument is that the trichromatic vision helped us to more easily spot all sorts of dangers in our environment, which is something that we already talked about when we talked about the animate monitoring hypothesis within the evolutionary psychology school. The next line within this old world branch of monkeys that would split away um, are the proboscis monkeys, for example, those cute, strange looking monkeys in Asia primarily. And this happened about 34 to 29 million years ago. So as you can see, there are kind of increasingly faster splits that are happening. And then the next one to split away from our dear family were the gibbons. Gibbons, cute little animals. They actually can walk upright already, and they split around 24 to 21 million years ago. So again, as you can see, these time intervals become shorter and shorter, which suggests that there was a rapid evolution, a very rapid adaptation to different environments, which therefore created different species. So now we're moving already to the great apes, so very, very close relatives. And our most distant cousin, if you want, is the orangutan living in Southeast Asia that split about 18 to 16 million years ago. And then the next one to split in Africa about 12 to 10 million years ago is the gorilla. So we are related to the gorilla, but our last common ancestor probably lived around, like that period about 11 million years ago. Now, the one that biologists always compare us with, the chimpanzee, split from us humans around 7.5 million years ago. So um, again, this is to just emphasize that We are related to chimpanzees, but we also developed a long time separately from them. So 7.6 million years is quite some time. But again, the emphasis here is that through these comparative analyses, we can start understanding what kind of features, behavioral features, genetic features we have in common and could be traced to a common ancestor.